What's going on, guys? With the recent confirmation of Ganyu's very long anticipated rerun, I want to provide those who are thinking about pulling for Ganyu my thoughts on this character as of patch 2.3. Ganyu was a pretty poorly understood character during her initial launch, being called Cryo Amber and just a support by many community members. Well, it turns out that Ganyu's longevity as a main DPS is very good, as it has been almost a year since her first banner, and she's still arguably the top DPS in Genshin. Ganyu was the first character I saved and went all in for waifu reasons only, and she has held the spot in my top 3 favorite Genshin characters, but Ganyu is not without her downsides, and I want to cover these along with her strengths in this video to help you determine if she's worthy of your primos. While I still think that Ganyu is just as good as the day she released, there have been a lot of things we've learned about this character, changes to the Genshin meta, and the addition of new characters and artifacts that will be discussed in this video. I do want to say that these are just my opinions. If Ganyu is your waifu, you should 100% summon for her. But with all the Genshin characters in the current roster and those coming out in the near future, I think this video will benefit some players that are more on the fence. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Ganyu has a long list of strengths that make her a valuable pull for almost every account. Ganyu's charge shot multiplier is higher than the skill and burst scaling of a lot of characters. Even if the initial Frostflake arrow misses an enemy, the bloom can still hit one or more enemies because it is an AoE attack and has higher scaling than the initial Frostflake arrow. I personally think this is one of the strongest skills to crown in the game. Ganyu's kit also has self-buffing built in. Her first passive talent gives 20% crit rate to the next Frostflake arrow she fires, which allows you to invest much higher into her crit damage. Her second passive provides herself and her teammates a 20% cryo damage bonus in the radius of her burst, and her burst radius is very large. Ganyu functions as a complete unit at Constellation 0, while her constellations add damage and quality of life improvements. The only constellation that really changes her playstyle is C6. Unlike some other units, her constellations feel more like direct buffs and less like fixes to an incomplete kit. Ganyu can be played as a main DPS or support unit, which makes her a valuable pull even for those that already have a full roster of DPS characters. Once you have enough DPS units built, pulling an additional main DPS character doesn't add value to your account, it is more for the fun factor. Ganyu fits into 2 distinct team compositions that allow you to run the artifacts and teammates that work best for your account. And on top of all of this, Ganyu can deal the bulk of her damage without using any stamina or energy. With Ganyu's strengths out of the way, let's touch briefly on her weaknesses. Weaknesses can be much more subjective than strengths, so do note that these are just my opinions as well as general ones that I've heard from the community. Ganyu can be challenging to play on mobile. Her kit is forgiving because of the AoE damage from the Frostflake arrow bloom, but it will be challenging for the average player to get the full potential from Ganyu on mobile. The damage potential in the more free-to-play friendly and comfy freeze comp is significantly lower than in a melt team and can be lower than other reaction-based main DPS units like Hu Tao. Her aim shot playstyle can definitely be a turnoff for a lot of people. To function at her optimum potential, she demands certain 5-star characters like Venti, Mona, and Kazuha. If you do not have Mona or Kokomi, running a freeze Ganyu comp definitely feels scuffed. She does sustained damage and not nuke damage like units like Eula and Ayaka, and she is squishy and easily disturbed while charge attacking. So with their general strengths and weaknesses out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about Ganyu's playstyle, team comps, and essential unit pairings. Ganyu fits into 2 specific teams, a melt composition and freeze composition. Not only are the damage output of these 2 comps drastically different, so are the character composition and playstyle. Both of these comps have their pros and cons. The goal in a melt Ganyu team is to have a consistent source of pyro application and to perform reverse melt with Ganyu with her charge shots because of their extremely high damage scaling and the 1.5 times damage multiplier gained by a reverse melt reaction. Melt Ganyu teams typically consist of Bennett, an Animo unit, and a flex spot. This spot can be a shielder like Zhongli or additional pyro unit like Xiangling. Melt Ganyu's best comp is currently Ganyu, Kazuha, Bennett, and Zhongli, and therefore requires some of the most valuable units in the game. That said, she also works very well alongside Bennett, Xiangling, and either Sucrose or Zhongli in a lower cost composition. In my opinion, melt Ganyu comps can be quite challenging to play. You want Ganyu on field as much as possible while maintaining burst uptime on your supports to ensure the pyro aura remains on enemies. Playing these comps without a shield unit is very difficult as they do require playing at a close distance where being interrupted is much more likely. Kazuha has made melt Ganyu comps much more viable as he can apply the pyro aura from Bennett with his burst in a relatively large AoE, thus opening up the last slot for a shield unit while buffing Ganyu and keeping keeping pyro uptime. In general, melt comps require higher overall investment, with units like Bennett, Zhongli, and Kazuha benefiting Ganyu greatly from their own personal stats. Melt Ganyu teams rely on the use of her taunt because of the close range you typically must play at, but you generally want to avoid cryo application outside of her charged shots. Melting with Ganyu's skill or elemental burst is a big loss to DPS because of their low damage multipliers. Melt Ganyu's DPS potential greatly outscales her other comps. Not only can she make use of the elemental mastery stat, she can fully utilize the buffs from a 4-piece Wanderer set, receives a 1.5 times multiplier from the melt reaction, and can use Bennett's attack buff. This essentially results in 3 times the damage Ganyu can do in a non-reaction based comp. Freeze Ganyu comps are much simpler to play, as the goal is to keep enemies permafrozen, meaning that the amount of damage you are taking is negligible. A permafreeze Ganyu comp relies on consistent AoE hydro application, which can really only be consistently done by Mona and Kokomi as of this patch. Morgana is the go-to Ganyu comp, which relies on a team consisting of 3 5-stars alongside Diona. I do not have Venti and found Sucrose is a completely viable replacement. Ganyu's damage output in these comps is significantly less than in a melt comp, but teams and builds are also less limiting in my opinion. Aside from investing in Mona's burst, Ganyu's other supports in a freeze comp are much more centered around crowd control and hydro application, and therefore investment in supports can be lower. Mona's Omen duration can be extended when enemies remain permafrozen, making her probably Ganyu's best freeze comp support, as Bennett does not work in this team. I believe that the release of Shenhe as a cryo buffing unit could make replacing Mona with Kokomi and Diona with Shenhe a very strong contender for the best freeze Ganyu team. Ganyu's burst has AoE damage with each icicle dropped. Because of this, clustering enemies together is necessary to maximize DPS, and either Venti, Sucrose, or Kazuha are essential to her freeze team. However, Venti is the only character who can consistently group enemies close enough so that all enemies take AoE damage from her burst, resulting in a quadratic increase in damage over a single target. Freeze Ganyu is also significantly easier to build around because of the 20 to 40% crit rate from Blizzard Strayer, 15% crit rate from Cryo Resonance, and Ganyu's built-in crit buff. Crit rate is one of the harder stats for most to balance, so this is an important consideration. The skill cap of playing Freeze Ganyu is pretty low, making these teams much more comfortable to play. If you're pulling Ganyu on a rerun, it is most likely because you love her character design or you believe she'll help you clear Abyss. It's not a surprise to most people that Morgana has been one of the strongest Abyss comps for the past year. This team especially excels in situations where you're fighting multiple enemies. If we look at the most popular Abyss teams in the past couple updates, Ganyu shows up on this list a number of times, meaning not only is she still extremely viable, there is some flexibility in her comps that give near equivalent results. Melt Ganyu is probably seen in Abyss a little less often because it is more challenging to play, but as discussed, the sustained damage potential of this team against single target enemies is probably the highest in all of Genshin. Both comps are extremely viable and will work for almost all Abyss situations given proper investment. I do not believe we've seen a Spiral Abyss in the past year where a pure freeze comp could not be run on one of the two halves. However, when we look at these freeze comps, all of them do rely on having both Mona and either Kazuha or Venti, and can be less accessible to newer players. I've tried running a budget Morgana comp with Sucrose and Floor 12, and it just falls short of my other team comps, which is something to keep in mind. Ever since the introduction of Ayaka, I personally find myself running Ayaka in place of Ganyu. While this isn't a situation of power creep, I do believe that Ayaka is a little stronger overall in current content for the average player, as her playstyle is a little more brain dead than Ganyu's. With the massive increases in HP pools of enemies we've seen over the past several Abyss lineups, I tend to gravitate toward units like Ayaka, Raiden, and Eula, who have huge burst damage over a unit that does sustain damage. The amazing thing about Ganyu is that Mihoyo made her so broken that she can function perfectly well as a main DPS or as a support. My current Ayaka team consists of Ayaka, Ganyu, Sucrose, and Kokomi. Ganyu is present for her taunt and her elemental burst, which applies cryo, does a good amount of damage, and provides cryo characters within her burst a 20% cryo damage bonus. This fact alone makes Ganyu an extremely worthy pull in my opinion. That said, I think that a cryo burst support really only works in a couple of select comps, which are a freeze comp with a cryo DPS and a Eula physical comp. No cryo support can keep up with the current pyro main DPS units, meaning that in these comps, Ganyu will be the one triggering melt with her burst most of the time, which is not ideal. It is possible that support Ganyu may lose a little value in freeze comps with the release of Shenhe, who appears to be a pure cryo buffer, but the existence of Shenhe will not make Ganyu a less valuable unit. That said, I do plan to replace Ganyu with Shenhe in my Ayaka freeze composition. Let's briefly touch on Ganyu's free-to-play friendliness and ease of building before wrapping up the video. There's no doubt that a whale Ganyu will outperform a free-to-play by a huge amount, but Ganyu functions extremely well as a main DPS with the craftable prototype Crescent and free-to-play Blackcliff Warbow. Looking at this weapon breakdown, we can see that with their buffs active, the prototype Crescent and Blackcliff only fall short of a Refinement 1 Amos for bloom damage by around 7%. This is pretty impressive. At Refinement 1 or without their buffs up, these weapons are significantly outperformed by an Amos bow, but these buffs can be obtained pretty easily in a lot of situations in the game. That said, the more unconditional passive of the Amos bow makes this weapon very strong. Where Ganyu's free-to-play friendliness can fall off pretty hard is in her artifact build, specifically in a melt comp. Ganyu's best artifact set when running a melt composition has been a 4-piece Wanderer set, and this also happens to be Ganyu's highest DPS composition. Most players who are not resin refreshing cannot justify farming bosses specifically for this set, as the time commitment is huge. This means that as a low spender, you're relying on the already ridiculous RNG to get a good Wanderer set. 4-piece Shimenawa set can actually give higher DPS than a Wanderer set, but this requires thought out rotations and really locks Ganyu into a melt composition as it is near impossible to use your burst. Freeze Ganyu wants a 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set, which is easily farmable and a little more forgiving in overall build, as your team composition and playstyle can be built around obtaining the additional crit rate from this set. On the contrary, Ganyu's melt teams are more free-to-play friendly and can rely on 2 to 3 4-star support units, which most players should have, with their freeze comps generally requiring Mona and Venti or Kazuha to reach their optimum potential. If you were on the fence about pulling Ganyu or how you'll use her if you do pull her, I hope that you found this video helpful. I do plan to make more consistent Genshin content in the near future and appreciate everyone who supported this channel over the past year. I'll see you guys soon for the next video. Peace.